Some companies just seem to be better at getting us to bring our hearts and our souls into work every day. And I believe that there is a new generation of those companies that we will soon see that will be so good at doing that, that we will actually call them soulful. Soulful companies. Now, don't worry if that made you a little nervous or made you go, what the heck are you talking about? I get it. I spent a good chunk of my career working in corporate America, and so I know that when we think of the company, we tend to think of it and associate it with words like profitability and efficiency and numbers and stuff like that we probably process in the left side of our brains. And so now I'm up here on the stage with the audacity to try to get you to connect that with this soul, this great mysterious thing that we don't even really understand. Now, don't worry if that makes you nervous. I spent a good chunk of my career working in corporate America, and so I know that when we think of the company.
Hello and welcome to the first social media power talk of the 1st of January in 2015. We're halfway through the first decade of the 21st century, and already we have our mantra. We talk about social business, we know that it trumps legacy models. The social enterprise is the way of the future. Social media is the path through which we somehow get there. It all sounds like magic. We know it can't be. And while we're spending time figuring it out, business as usual makes its own demands. Sales need to be made, bills need to be paid, the business needs to be managed. Nothing can wait while we figure things out. We have, of course, a perfectly good model for running a business. Any business, whether large or small, successful or not, a business is primarily responsible to itself. In order to justify its existence, it has to work in a way that allows it to sell a service or a product and make money from it. More than that, the business is obligated by definition to look at ways where it can become more efficient and more profitable. There are margins that need to be improved and products and services that require incremental updates. Projects need to be managed, new projects need to be put in place, and everything is driven by the unrelenting pressure of doing business in a bottom-line economy where the competition never sleeps. If that sounds like there's little room left for spending time, energy, and ultimately money on redefining the fundamental model of a business, it is because it is. So what are we talking about? Why is social business even a thing? Why are we discussing ways to become more transparent, more connected with customers, friendlier, more social and community-focused even, when we already know what works? Why are we so bent on redefining the way business is done when doing business is already so difficult? Answering just that question is what this current discussion is all about. And with us today to help us answer it is former Microsoft executive, TEDx speaker, author, blogger, and social business thinker, Gideon Rosenblatt. Gideon has been a thorn on the side of traditional businesses, pushing his ideas for radical reform through his website, The Vital Edge. Please welcome him.
Thanks, David. I've been looking forward to this for the last couple of weeks when you first mentioned it. So, yeah. Hi, everybody.
Well, I'm very glad. Here's how we're going to do. Basically, the first thing we really need to do here is define what a social business is. And essentially, the belief is that the moment you have a Twitter account, a Facebook page, perhaps a G+ account, and even a G+ business page, well, there you are. You've got it. What do you think about that?
I think that pretty much sums it up. You might as well wrap it up. Well, it's really interesting. So there are these two, even in the comments that we saw around this event, there were kind of differences of opinion that were coming up there. So there definitely are these two definitions of what a social business is. One is the kind of, it's about social media, social networks. The other is social more in the sense of social good, or probably the cleaner definition that doesn't seem to get as much misinterpretation as social enterprise. But even that, just a quick story on that. A couple years ago, I was down in San Francisco at the Salesforce. So Salesforce is a big database supplier. So most of you probably know about these guys. They have a huge gathering called Dreamforce. And at this particular one that I went to, they were rolling out this idea of the social enterprise. And they were going to brand, they were going to brand that, and more in the sense of social media and social networks. And they got huge pushback from the social enterprise sector. Muhammad Yunus in particular, he's kind of the godfather of a lot of this stuff. And they backed off. They said, "You're right. That's not what social enterprise is."
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because I think it also, in many ways, I think this basically prepares my first question to you, which is, we've been talking about the concepts of transparency and honesty and social goodness and being embedded in the community for a long time now. And we're already halfway through the first decade of the 21st century. So really, why have things not happened?
You mean in terms of business using itself as a force for good in the world? Why is that not taking off? Is that
why don't we see more and more business being a true social enterprise? Why don't we see more and more business actually being a social business without it being a thing, without it being something which is an outlier? Why isn't it the norm?
Yeah, well, I have two answers for that. The first is that I think you kind of have to look at the economy in the what I would call the kind of the global economy of big publicly traded firms, and then the kind of the smaller economy of more local firms, many of whom actually do a lot of the stuff, and hopefully we'll get into more of the details of what we mean by this, the social business. But a lot of those businesses actually operate that way, even though they don't think of themselves as a social business. They don't call themselves mission-driven or anything like that. If you examine what they're actually doing, they exhibit a lot of the behavior. So I think that below the surface, there actually is a lot of this that is happening. But on the bigger side of it, the kind of the large corporation side of it, I think that we have since the 70s kind of been subjected to a kind of a mass delusion about what the role of business really is.
Well, let's go on.
Yeah, well, I think what happened during that time was that there's this notion of shareholder primacy, which says basically that the primary focus, the only real reason a business exists, is to make profits and pass those profits onto its shareholders. And that thing got embedded in all kinds of thinking by consultants, and it's embedded in business schools, it's embedded everywhere. And I think that is one of the biggest reasons why we've had such a shift in the way that we think about business.
Okay, I mean, that's fascinating, because in many ways we also hear that solving the puzzle of social business is part of a $600 billion industry. It's a bit of a puzzle which needs to somehow be a solution to it has to be found in terms of in a practical way. Mm-hmm. And in respect of that, I think you've also got yourself direct experience in terms of the practicalities involved when it comes to running a social business. You used to run a social enterprise yourself, right?
I did, yeah. For about 10 years.
Tell us a little bit about that, yeah. I mean, first of all, obviously, in terms of the ideology, you totally understand it, but in terms of the practicalities, you must have faced quite a steep learning curve.
I definitely did. This was, I started there back in like 2001. It had been, I'd been at Microsoft for about 10 years prior to that, and so my worldview of how things worked and how to actually get stuff done in a business was completely flipped on its head when I went and decided to go run this organization. It was an existing organization. It was a technology consulting shop. At the time I joined, it was small. I mean, it was. We had 6 people at the time. And by the time I left, it got bigger, but not a whole lot bigger. It was about 24 people, something like that. The model was really interesting. By the end, we were about 65-70% fee for services, so market income, and then the rest of it was supplemented by philanthropy. So it was a really interesting, it was a very interesting model. I would say that one of the biggest learnings from that is that it takes a lot of creativity to it takes a lot of creativity just to make money, I think, but it takes even more creativity to make money while you're also serving a mission.
Okay, and here's an interesting question, because obviously, we talk in terms of creativity, and creativity has always been part of business. Perhaps we've called it incremental improvements or even innovation, which is a little bit of a leap on top of that. But things have always changed. So why is it so radical when it comes to applying in a social business model?
Why is innovation so radical?
Well, yeah, why do we have to be that extra bit more creative in a social business environment?
Okay.
Shouldn't it be easier, perhaps?
Yeah, you would think so. You would think so. But just it's a very practical problem, which is that if you're trying to just optimize for profits, that's actually, it's hard enough to do. As anybody who's run a business knows that just doing that is hard enough. But when you're then trying to basically use the money that's coming in and invest it back into a mission and make sure that every day that the decisions that you're making, you're kind of using this dual mindset. I literally, when I would work, when I would come into work, I had two things that guided my decisions every day. One was, is this going to break us financially? And that had to come first, honestly. I wish I could say that wasn't the case, that we were super idealistic in the sense of, no, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. No, that was the first, that had no money, no mission. That's kind of the first mantra. But then the other thing was that by year 6, year 7, we had done a lot of really good thinking about the outcomes that we were trying to achieve for our mission. That was some of the hardest work I've ever done, was thinking in terms of those kind of outcomes and being really disciplined about how to break that down and into measurable objectives that we could actually achieve.
And this, obviously, we could argue that you have had an advantage here because you came from a corporate background. You brought in the legacy model mentality in many ways, which then you were able to fit into that kind of environment. So you're perfectly aware that you need to create a process which would allow you to get from stage A to stage B. And sort of, reading this and, also following some of the comments on the stream about what you said earlier, the question begs itself. If you have a legacy model business with shareholders, is there ever a chance or even a hope that it would actually translate or transform itself into a real social business?
I think that's a really good question. Again, I'll answer this in two different answers. One is I think that there's some interesting innovations that are happening right now around things like the B Corporation and benefit corporations, that law, the laws that are being put into place across the United States and abroad too, all over the world actually. Those are aimed at giving the management of the firm the legal grounds to actually pursue objectives other than just profit maximization and passing on as much profit to shareholders as possible. So okay. I think that is a useful step. But in point of fact, actually, if you're a shareholder and you're seeing and you see management making decisions that you believe are taking away your money, right? The dividends that you could be getting, or the profits that could be plowed back into the company to raise its stock price, you're going to be mad, right? And so you're going to put pressure on the board, which then shows up as pressure on the CEO. So on the one hand, I think that there's some interesting innovations that are happening that will help on this front, but fundamentally, I think that there is this very difficult need to kind of keep the stock price at a certain level and to keep the dividends flowing.
Okay. I'm going to stop you here just a minute because we're going to backtrack on this.
Yeah.
Because you're making some really important points. And, we started this segment, this video, basically with you talking in your TED Talk, talking about the soulful company and the company which has a soul. And really, we basically need to think about what you said there. Because a company that actually has a kind of approach, a company that has a kind of soul, does it really operate in a radically different manner to a normal company? Does that mean that normal companies are completely soulless?
Yeah.
And by normal, I mean the legacy enterprise here, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have to just one little kind of sidestep, which is to say, you cannot imagine how much pushback I got from that talk. A lot from my family, but and even I think when you start talking about terms like the soul, and you connect it with companies like even companies that we've kind of grown to love, like Google or REI, or it kind of, people feel a little bit odd, and it makes some people mad. So I will. That's the preface to what I'm about to say. One of the points I was trying to make in that talk, that TED Talk, was that the soul, for lack of a better term, is where all of the good stuff is, right? It's all the really interesting stuff that our creativity, our ability to connect, empathize, all of those things that are just so valuable and becoming more and more valuable, especially as we automate, right? That's the stuff that is hard for automation to copy. So when you're a company like, Amazon, maybe not Amazon, but Apple. Let's take Apple, right? Okay. They on certain elements, they actually are able to kind of tap the soul of people, like their desire for creativity, those kinds of things, right? The desire for great design and beauty. The question is, what's really going on there? Are they kind of tapping the soul there and using it as a force? And if so, what for, right? What's the end goal? I take this, I kind of step back and I look at this and I go, as a human being, I can try to use my soul as a way to make more money, and there's something about that just feels kind of creepy, right?
But yeah.
Right? So, but I think when you look at this question of the social business, there are lots of good reasons for doing it as a way to make the business stronger, to make more money, and it actually works. There's proof that doing good to do well, that's kind of the phrase, do good to do well, actually works. But I think that the people who I've seen do this the best, and these are the folks who, they're not doing it for that. They're doing it because there's something inside them that is pulling them there. And then they're able to then make it work, make the business work, because the flame is actually inside. The flame, that desire to make a difference with the business, is already there.
It sounds like there's a lot of passion and perhaps not as much structure in a social business or a soulful company. And perhaps there should be a little bit of structure in that, helping to channel it. But this is just a suggestion, because I'm going to ask you a question now.
Yeah.
And the question is, well, from the we see very few companies, relatively speaking, that actually do this. There are very few companies that go down this path, and that would suggest that there are inherent difficulties in a social business model, which we perhaps gloss over because from our perspective it makes perfect sense to get there. From our audience's perspective, it makes perfect sense to get there. But I don't run multi-billion-dollar business. The audience doesn't, and those businesses seem to have a logic of their own which simply doesn't quite grasp where they should be getting at, or how they should change in order to get there. So really, I suppose what I'm asking is, what are the implementables? If we're to sort of define a path for any kind of business, and here we're talking about small business as well as big, what should they be looking at? What should be first? The first step, the second step, third step before they get to the 10th?
Yeah. Well, John, let's see. What would be maybe helpful, David, is to take just a minute before we try to answer that, and just talk a little bit about more specifically what are the elements that we're really talking about here. I think of a social business. I mean, this is a vast oversimplification, what I'm about to say, but I think of it as kind of two different ideas. The first is what you might call mission-driven. That they are serving a mission, and that mission is not just to maximize profits for shareholders. A lot of companies will say that is our mission, but and then the second is what I call regenerative, but others would call stakeholder-centric model, which is that you're really, you're managing that company in a way that plows back a lot of the profits back to the people who are critical to the success of that firm over the long haul.
Okay, can I just stop you here for a second? Because I think giving this regenerative company as a new sort of social business model of sorts, in a way, and shouldn't every business automatically invest into its staff? Shouldn't it invest into the people who work in it, who ultimately make it successful?
You would think, right? I mean, it's and actually, if you look at the top companies today, they actually do seem to be doing that much more, right? Google, Facebook, REI is a really interesting model of this, actually. But these are companies that definitely are investing back into their employees, and what I'm talking about here is actually even extending it beyond the employees to think more broadly about the rest of the stakeholders, who, not just the suppliers, but also the customers, and that's a really interesting. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things that's happening today is that customers, and a lot of this is because of the social business, the kind of the social media side of social business, customers are actually contributing to the value proposition today in ways that we just couldn't see nearly as plainly before. If you look at even just Google+, look at what we're doing right now. I mean, even this Hangout, right? We're spending time doing this thing. We're doing it because we like doing this, and hopefully other people are enjoying this. But at the same time, it's building the Google+ platform, right? And the same thing with all of these things. So what are the models where those value contributions are really recognized and those people are taken care of? And that's part of what. But I think you're right. It does make sense, right, that you would do that. If those are people who are critical to long-term success.
Right. Well, we've got a Gartner quote. They did a study, and they're expecting 85% of business not to even meet their social business stated goals. And I think we've got a clip on that. But essentially, when so many businesses are expected to fail, it would suggest that the failing is caused by something which we can't quite quantify. But it's endemic across pretty much every legacy business model, which is still active today, because businesses doesn't transform from one model to another in a day. So if I were to ask you, what would be the first step required from a very practical point of view, what would you say?
And just to be clear, the first step towards moving towards a kind of a social business.
Yes.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I would start with the mission, because I think that there's this tendency to think super grandiose about mission, when really, as a starting place, all we have to do is kind of go back the pre-70s, and Peter Drucker is one of my favorite business writers. And if you go back and read his stuff, he's talking about mission. Sometimes he even uses the word. But let me distinguish what I mean by mission. We can call one, let's call it a customer mission, which is, this is what more traditional businesses have always done. And then you might.
I was going to say that doesn't every business has a mission statement?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And many of them are off in some server someplace, never looked at, and never truly integrated into the work of the business. Okay. But what I'm talking about here is so first there's the kind of the customer mission, and then if we have time, hopefully we'll get to kind of the broader picture of that, which is a real social mission, which is trying to use that customer mission as a way to serve social objectives. Okay. But to your point, yes, I mean every business definitely should have that focus on a mission. Now, the companies that don't succeed are the ones that I think lose track of that customer mission. And by that, I mean,
why do you think that happens, though? I mean,
well, I mean, not to keep heaping onto the profit extraction thing, but I think that when the reason that you're doing the work is to make money, then actually fulfilling the mission starts to look less and less interesting. I mean,
let me act as devil's advocate here and say, well, isn't the reason for existence of any kind of business to make money?
Well, see, that's what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that that in a way, that's kind of the spell that we've fallen into. Yes, it definitely is, right? On one level, it has to make money in order to survive, in order to feed its stakeholders, in order to, but on the other level, if that's the only reason that it exists is to make money, then that's, I think, personally, I believe that is what's getting us into the trouble that we're getting into. I mean,
okay.
Well, yeah.
I'm smiling a little because I think you're absolutely right in what you sort of just said. But I think earlier on you also pointed a little bit towards part of the solution, how we address this problem. Because if a business is there to make money, that's what it's there to do primarily. And then you think, well, that is what I need to do, and I'll do it at any cost.
Yeah.
Soul or no soul, I need to make money.
Right.
But I think earlier on you said also that you set up a legal part of the business which was essentially not money focused, and you held the business accountable to a different tune, if we call it that.
Yeah.
And I think that's again part of creating structures, isn't it? And it's taking the lessons we know about processes and structures and aims and goals and steps, which have always worked in a traditional sense of the word in terms of a legacy model, a legacy business, and applying it in the same structured way to a social business,
absolutely,
a social enterprise.
Yeah, I think that is one of the areas where social enterprises can get into trouble, right? Is when it's all heart and no brains, or not really thinking in terms of processes and thinking in terms of the money. This question, I want to come back to just for a moment this question of the mission, because I think it is where companies can make very practical and relatively easy steps forward without kind of changing the whole focus of the company into a social enterprise, right? I think just the idea that if you take this idea of a customer mission one step further and say, I only succeed if I am fulfilling the mission of my customer, right? It's flipping it a little bit and saying, okay, I have to step into the shoes. If I'm a hammer manufacturer, if I really get into this mode of being mission-driven, then I only succeed when my customer is successfully using that hammer to hang a shelf or to build a whatever, right, a treehouse.
Okay.
And we look at that and we say, really? Is that really, that's how you're successful? No. The way you're successful is you make money, right? That's how, you sell your hammer. And so that's the kind of the traditional view of success was sales. But then, in the 70s and 80s, we started looking at, and I think some of this was in response to the quality revolution that happened, but we started asking questions of like, are the customers actually satisfied? So customer satisfaction started to become a focus because we knew that that was the key to repeat sales. And so as we started getting databases and things like that, we started saying, oh, wow, we can actually now track and see that customer satisfaction is actually the key to somebody buying again. But what I'm talking about is going one step deeper beyond customer satisfaction to customer success. And that means stepping into the shoes of the customer and saying, wow, did you use my hammer to create something beautiful, something amazing, right? Because those then come back. That's the relationship. Talk about social business in the other sense, right? When there's that kind of a partnership, we end up, a customer mission partnership where I cannot succeed.
Suppose what you're saying in many ways is that essentially it changes the perspective of how you do business. So instead of just selling a tool and that being the goal, the end goal that justifies you being in business, you sell a tool as a means to something else, which would perhaps loosely call achieving the happiness of your customer.
Yeah.
Guys, can I just interrupt here with, there's this great conversation going on in the Google Plus event stream, and there's a bunch of different comments that really a lot of them have to do with, I'm just going to bring up this one from Tonya Rufus, and really it all has to do with this idea of responsibility. We're talking a lot about the responsibility of the business, but I think this comment is interesting because she says, we have to be educated consumers, shareholders in the U.S. I make it a point not to support any business that is not helping the communities where they sell products. So could the two of you kind of discuss this idea of, because Gideon, you did mention relationships. Relationships involve, both parties, but when it comes down to it, who's responsible here?
That's a good question. So Gideon?
Yeah, I love that. I think it's great. It goes right to, Alex, that was a perfect segue to the thing we're talking about even, because it's, we're talking about the partnership with the customer. And so, just to go back, because it's such a simple example of the hammer, I mean, I can't succeed without that customer actually being good at hammering. If the customer says to me, you're not thinking enough about these issues, the first being, am I really succeeding with your stuff? The customer can walk away. But kind of going the next step, which is, the customer saying, and not only that, but I want you to design that hammer so that, I mean, this may sound ridiculous, but so that I can do good things for the world with this hammer. Make it easy for me to do that. Now, hard to imagine that. Hello?
Can y'all hear me?
Hello?
Hey, Gideon.
Was that on my? That must have been on my end. No.
We just had a Google server crash.
Oh.
So
that doesn't happen very often.
I'll let them know. Google server crash.
If we bring everybody on at the same time.
I can say not our fault, right? Google server crash, not our fault.
Oh, be careful what you talk about.
Hang on one sec, guys.
I guess we have to be careful about what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. Well, I love what you said. I think that's absolutely fantastic because essentially that's rewriting the mission of business as a whole, isn't it? And the moment we start discussing this, doesn't that also begin to take into account both small and large businesses? Because the distinction begins to vanish. You know, large businesses used to think, well, we have big budgets and deep pockets and a lot of people, and we market in a certain way, and that marketing basically segmented the market and defined the relationship between them and their perceived customer base. And the small business person used to say, well, you know, I'm local, I just hang out outside my shop and say hello to everybody who passes by. And that action, and I'm oversimplifying here, obviously, but that action essentially defined the relationship between that business and its customer base. And now that distinction is being eroded because technology and perception and capabilities and awareness and transparency are coming into the mix. And they're changing the entire game. So whether you're running a small business or a large business, in many ways you're facing some of the same challenges. You're always facing arguably the same number of challenges. And what really is different, perhaps, is the scale and maybe even a little bit of the execution and how you're going to go about it. What do you think?
Yeah. I think that the challenges are similar, but you know, I think one of the things I think a lot about with local business is that, you know, while national businesses or multinationals do have franchises and they have local stores and things like that, there is something that feels a little bit different about that local business, and it's more of just a feeling for a lot of people. But actually, if you back that out, and people have done this, you know, they've looked at financial flows, and you know, when you buy from a local business, that money tends to stay in the community. It might go up to the owner of that business, but then that owner buys a fancier house, a new car, you know, but it stays local. Whereas, you know, if I move my money over and buy at a Starbucks, or not to pick on Starbucks because they're a local Seattle company, everybody's local someplace, but when you buy from these bigger firms, that money, you know, tends to get extracted out of the local economy and gets moved up. So I think this also, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting, but you know, what you just said plays in the recent Luxembourg tax loophole debacle, where Amazon and Google and Facebook are based there, and the amount of tax they pay for the amount of money they're making is incredibly low. Yeah. It's legal, so they're not actually doing anything illegal, but certainly it doesn't feel right in terms of a sense of social justice, perhaps, although they're not really breaking the law. Right. Yeah. We have a similar thing here in Washington State, where I live, where Microsoft was manufacturing, now in the days when it manufactured Office in a box and on a CD, that manufacturing plant was down in Nevada. And it did that partially because it was cheaper to manufacture down there, but a lot of it was because of the tax reasons. And so they avoided a lot of taxes. And people were understandably upset about that here.
So I think, doesn't that kind of suddenly change the entire conversation a little bit? Because, you know, we're talking about business, but really these days, like pretty much everything else, we realize how things are connected. We can't talk about business without talking about social structures and society and social conscience, and inevitably politics, which are a reflection, an abstraction, and a reflection of the social pressures which we apply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's. Were you going to say something else there? Or?
Well, no, I was going to say, well, it does not suddenly change the entire game plan, because again, it's not what we expect a business to be. We also have to begin to change the way society operates and the way politics operates within that matrix, and the way everything impacts on everything else.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true. I mean, even just taking these examples of the tax evasion, right? You know, those are laws that were put in place and probably influenced by business But if I'm the head of Microsoft or Amazon or whoever, I have a fiduciary duty to avoid those taxes. I mean,
okay.
It may sound immoral, right? But part of
the... No, I think it comes back down to the initial part of the conversation that they're not doing anything wrong. A business is there to make money. So the moment we start talking about social business, we actually have to make it make sense within that matrix somehow. It really has to also go ahead and make money, while at the same time investing in its staff and seriously investing in its communities. And we need, and perhaps this is where the evidence is lacking to some degree, a clear path which actually says, you do this and you do that and you do that, and yes, you will make more money, you will be more successful. And that isn't in evidence, even though we still have some models of social businesses which work. Zappos, case in point, the John Lewis Partnership in the UK, it's a multi-billion-dollar corporation. We have Gore-Tex Associates across the globe there. These are private companies, although they have shareholders in a loose sense of the word. They don't have the public structure. Yeah.
This gets us to the question of ownership, which is ultimately where the question of stakeholders takes you. This is such a rich area to explore. I'll just take it back to Jack Welch, right? Jack Welch, who was not really a friend to labor at any point. The people called him Neutron Jack, right, because of what he did to the General Electric. But he ran General Electric for many, many years. He's quoted as saying that shareholder primacy is the stupidest idea in the world, right? That's his. And why? So why is he saying that? You have to look at that and go, why is he saying that? I mean, there's now a growing body of research that actually shows that when the company is overly focused on taking its profits out and passing them on to shareholders, it kills the business. Look at Google, look at Amazon, look at the flack that those companies take for not listening to shareholders, right? And in plowing more and more money back into their businesses. They get a lot of flack for that. But is it the right thing to do? Absolutely. Like they're investing in their future and in the future of their stakeholders and in the future, particularly in their cases, their employees.
Okay, well, there is, despite all the things which we've brought in terms of difficulties and obstacles, there's a segment of the market that has actually seen the light. There are parts of politics which have put some force behind creating or helping to create social businesses. We know that in the UK, for instance, there's a $500,000 impetus which goes to social enterprise schemes, which is there to basically help them develop. And really, I suppose the question here is, what should we do? Suppose, for instance, as a consumer, you want to encourage social business, or as a business owner, you want to head that way.
Where to get started, right? So there are some. I love the B Corp website. I think it's bcorp.net. That is a very practical place to go and figure out the organization I used to run. Groundwire, became a certified B Corp. What they help you to do is go through a series of kind of questions. It's like a certification process. That is, and they're very, it's a very nitty-gritty, pragmatic approach to trying to answer these questions. So I think that's one thing. If I had forgotten to say that at any point in this, I would have kicked myself. So that's a really interesting resource for people who are interested in this. The other thing I would say is, again, start with the mission, because the mission, once you start thinking in terms of that kind of impact, it leads you.
Let me, you've mentioned this a few times, and I do get it's really critical.
Right.
And having said that, I've also been present in companies with quite a long history who turn around and realize that they haven't really got a mission statement, which is quite frightening.
Yeah.
So really, I suppose my question is to you, Okay, let's start with a mission. How do you get to that mission? How do you define it? Whose job is it to put it together? Is it the person who owns the business? Is it everybody's? Is it the customers? Is it a combination of all these factors?
Yeah. So let me use another word actually, because I think sometimes the mission statement, people just roll their eyes, right? Like, oh, let's do our mission statement, and then everybody starts going, oh my God, this is going to be another 15-hour meeting. You know? So impact is a better way of thinking about this, I think. And actually, this is one of the areas where the nonprofit sector is ahead of business. They have these tools. One of them is a theory of change. One of them is a logic model. And what that does, talk about process, it's a very disciplined approach to looking at the desired impact. And then, there's goals and then outcomes, and then the outputs, and then the inputs, and then the resources. There's like a very defined process for thinking about this. And I will tell you, David, that I spent like a year and a half trying to get that straight for Groundwire, and it was some of the most difficult work, because when you really think about the impact that you want to have, it's a very difficult question of where to stop, right?
I think on that note, Alex has pulled up a fantastic comment from Gina Fidel, which pretty much reflects, I think, what you said earlier about people rolling their eyes and pulling faces about the length of the meeting, where basically Gina says that any kind of mission statement is a lot of empty words people seem to be paying lip service to simply because they feel they have to, and that's it. There's no feeling behind it, which might perhaps lead us a little bit back to your soulful company talk, because you need to have a kind of soulful approach when you create that mission statement together, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, hello, Gina. Thank you for that question. That's a great question. Again, it's a question of what's the means and what's the ends. Are we using this stuff as a way to make more money? And when that happens, then these mission statements tend to be things that we feel like we have to do, and blah blah blah. But when the impetus behind this is really coming from your heart or from your soul or whatever you want to call it, but it's in your guts, whatever it is, right? It's something on the inside. The people I talk to who are truly interested in social business, they're not doing it because it's a way to make more money. Because frankly, there are a lot of other ways to make money that are much easier than doing this. I mean, that's the truth. This is not for everybody. It's actually relatively hard to do. So you've got to want to do it.
Right. Okay. And here's let's just check first with Alex. Alex, any more questions? Any more? Yes. Any more great comments from the audience?
Yeah, so I just want to say the audience in Twitter has been relatively quiet, but the audience in Google Plus has been doing awesome. They seem to be interested in a couple of things. The first one was the mission statement. A lot of them were really interested in the idea of the mission statement. It sounds like a lot of them, like Gina Fidel, have run into companies that don't really have a solid mission statement. The other thing that a lot of them got stuck on was the idea of the soulful company. One person, Steve Bonin, said, if we step back from the word soul and use humanization instead, do we still have the same thing? And a couple of them kind of played with this idea of a soul. So what do you think, Gideon? What's the difference between the two? Is there a difference between soul and humanization?
I don't know. I mean, boy, this is, talk about a personal word, but Steve, I think that we're talking about the same thing. I think, here's the way I think about it. We fool ourselves when we get pulled into an organization or any kind of large system, right? We kind of fool ourselves into feeling like we've got to do this or we've got to do that, right? And what this is, whether you call it soul or humanization or whatever it is, all it is really getting us to take a step back and say, I'm more than this. I am more than this company. I am bigger than this. This is not me. I work here. I throw my heart and soul at some of this stuff, but it is not my heart and soul. And so humanization is a great way of thinking about that too, right? Because it's bringing back the recollection that we are in fact first human, even if we are working in these giant systems.
Awesome. Okay, that's an awesome reply there. Okay, and since we are talking about this, now here's another question, Gideon, which perhaps will come up. We're talking about companies and money and scale and effort and processes. So the question is, if you're a small business, are you working at a disadvantage again? Is it harder for you to become a social business?
Boy, on the one hand, I say yes. On the other hand, I say no. What do I mean by that? On the yes, it is harder front is you got less resources, right? You may have 5 people working in that business, and they're completely strapped, right? They got. I mean, believe me, I've been there. I've run. Now I can say, I spent a good chunk of my life running a small organization. It is tough. People stretched very thin. So let alone having them do Twitter. Now think about having people focused on trying to fulfill a mission, right, and tracking their outcomes around like the change that they're causing in the world. So the resource constraint. Bigger companies can have whole departments. I mean, there's directors of sustainability. There's all of that stuff. So on the one hand, yes, it is more difficult. On the other hand, and David, you and I were talking about this a little bit before the show. I think that on the other hand, I think that the local businesses actually have a huge leg up here. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, they don't have this shareholder primacy thing pulling at them and constantly, like the demands of a publicly traded company. If you hear CEOs talking about that pressure, I mean, it's got to be intense. I would hate to do that, right? Because there's just so many of these things pulling you away from doing what you want to do. As a small business, you do have that control. I mean, that's more in your control. And I think that on the stakeholder side of things, there's just a natural, if you're local, there's a natural set of relationships that are already there. These are people in your community. And so the challenge becomes how to fuse the social good sense of social business with the technology sense of social business. I think that it's a challenge for local kind of smaller businesses to be able to use all of these tools in ways, it costs money to do this, and it costs time more than money. These days, it's really about time and attention. But I think that, if you think about the customer partnerships and the customer mission, the technology can actually play a huge role in that, in helping to facilitate and make that connection strong.
Awesome. Okay, so we got any more comments on this, Alex?
Yeah, so I think that this comment from Joey is, hi Joey. I think it's a great, we have 6 minutes, so I think it's a great way to kind of end this conversation. Could this entire conversation be summed up as expecting business to be done with purpose beyond financial gain? And I think that's a great question, because that is really, we've been talking about the finances and really the separation of finance and doing social good. So the other thing that I want to tack on to this is a lot of people in the comments have been asking, what is a good model? And someone even pointed out that Google isn't necessarily the best model for a social business. So I'm just going to tack that onto this. First, can we sum this up as expecting business to be done with purpose beyond financial gain? And then what business, in your opinion, Gideon, is actually doing this right now?
Yeah. So to answer the question, yes, yes, and business done with purpose beyond financial gain. Yes, I think that is kind of the essence of this thing. And the and to that statement would be, and taking care of their stakeholders. Taking care of so much focus is on the shareholders nowadays that we are really robbing the long-term, kind of the future of the firm, and the people that really support it and are critical to its success. So I think that's the additional piece. Who's doing this well? Here's my problem with this, is that my experience base on this is from running one of these, from reading. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been focusing on this. I'm not a consultant. I don't actually focus on serving this segment as a consultant, but I observe. I look at. I think, because they're in my backyard, I think that REI is a great company to look at. The reason that I like them is because they are very mission focused. They are very stakeholder centric. I mean, they're actually a consumer cooperative. They're owned by their customers. And when I've talked to people who work there, it's clear that they have a great deal of freedom to invest back in the company in ways that their competitors just can't. And so it's they're kind of it's an interesting company in the sense that they're kind of hard to beat. And for a while now, that's changing now, but for a while there were not that many people going after them. I think Patagonia is another one that's very interesting in this area as well. And then look at last thing is look at the B Corp website, because there's a whole list of them, and they go into a lot of interesting profiles on those companies.
Okay, Gideon, you write quite a bit about companies or rather business models a company should follow or should be thinking about when they're actually trying to implement a social business model and trying to sort of shift their thinking a little bit and their perception. Is there anything coming up in your blog at the moment which we should be looking at?
There is a piece that I wrote a couple months ago, actually, that would be interesting. If anybody's interested in these topics, there's one that is about, it's like 3 pieces of advice for social entrepreneurs, and it's fairly pragmatic sets of kind of advice about how to think about this stuff, particularly the tension between money and mission, how to manage that.
Okay, great. All right, and begin to wrap up now. So any comments which Alex, have you got any comments which we really need to address before we get to the end of the show?
Not at the moment. I just want to thank everybody so much for joining us, and keep asking your questions either in the Google Plus event or tweet at social media today using the hashtag SMTPowerTalk, and I will make sure these guys answer your questions. That's what I do.
That's great. Gideon, you've been warned. If you don't answer them, Alex will hunt you down.
I've cleared my schedule. I have an hour of time dedicated to follow up, so yeah, great. I'll look forward to that, actually. Cool. Yeah.
Well, getting to the end of it, really, I mean, this has been a really difficult question because there's no definitive answer. We're still in a transitionary phase. We still face huge challenges, and even the businesses which actually apply this successfully, they still struggle with it, and they struggle with themselves.
Yeah.
From my own direct experience, I will say that businesses that manage to do this are basically psychotic in the sense that they have within one entity 2 different forms. They have 2 different parts of their business. One is focused externally, and it's there to make money in the full sense of the word, driven by the same business principles that any other business across the planet is actually driven by. The second half of them, however, holds the first half accountable to itself and its practices in terms of its staff, its customers, its mission statement, so there's somebody looking at it and it has to mean something, and generally its path as it goes into the future and the impact it has on communities and the planet. As you probably realize, this kind of setup is difficult to occur within a normal legacy business without some willpower and extensive investing. It's even harder to occur within a small business if somebody is not really willing to implement it and then stick to it. Small businesses usually have greater temptations in terms of not following things through because there's too few people to do things and corners are cut and shortcuts are taken. So really, I suppose the bottom line here, and everything that Gideon has said, is that essentially, if there's no structured approach, if there's no processes, if there's no clear thinking in terms of end goals, you really are not going to get there, no matter what your heart says and no matter what you think your brain says, because the reality will be against you. So this is a great takeaway to take on board for anybody watching this, because essentially that's where your head should be. Gideon, thank you ever so much for being here. Thank you for your time and your insights. I'd like to thank Alex, because without her we wouldn't have had any of the comments coming through, and none of this would have been possible without John. This is a Social Media Today event. This is David Amerland saying goodbye.